and the gate groaned as Maeve pushed the old timber with the hand not holding her satchel. The sun was already dipping low over the braes, bathing the farmyard in an orange light. The farmstead looked weary, as did the man standing on the porch. Garrett held a wailing babe, a weak cry, the sound of one too tired to ask any longer. And beside him, a girl of about 6 watched the stranger with eyes too hard for a child. The kitchen was dark, the hearth cold, and the smell that hung in the air wasn't of food, but of neglect. It was there, seeing that strong man, broken inside, that Maeve took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change all their fates. "If you'll have me, I can make supper." And what seemed like a simple phrase from a hungry young woman, "Dear friends," transformed into one of the most beautiful stories these country lanes have ever carried on the wind. If you believe that God sometimes places the right person in our path, just as hope is fading, hit that like button now. Subscribe to the Tales of Old Ireland channel. Activate the bell so you don't miss a single story, and tell me in the comments from which corner of Ireland you're listening. Let's begin. In the heart of rural Ireland, in days gone by, tales like this echoed between streams and boreens. The lane that cut through that remote corner of County Kerry had no name on maps, because maps didn't concern themselves with places where the world seemed to have forgotten to arrive. It was a wide, red earth track, squeezed between round, heather-covered hills, and almost no one was seen on it at that hour. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the silence was broken only by the mournful call of a curlew hidden in some gorse bush. Maeve had been walking that lane for nearly 3 days, stopping by riverbanks to drink water and sleeping under trees when night fell. Her small leather satchel bumped against her leg with each step, and inside it was little the world would consider valuable, but everything Maeve truly possessed. A change of clothes, a bone comb from her mother, and a hard-bound notebook where her mother's tiny script recorded recipes passed down from grandmother to daughter, from daughter to granddaughter. Maeve was 22, but she carried in her body and soul the weight of having lived too many lives in too little time. Her father, a drover by trade and a wanderer by nature, died in a horse-cart accident when she was still a girl, leaving behind only debts and the quiet longing for a man who spent more time on the road than at home. Her mother, a washerwoman with chapped hands and a gentle heart, held on for 2 more years, until consumption did what sorrow could not. Maeve was left alone at 16 and was taken in by a great-aunt named Deirdre, who lived in a small rented cottage behind a boarding house and survived on small tailoring jobs. Aunt Deirdre was stern on the outside, but she had a silent affection that showed in her gestures, and it was she who taught Maeve to turn little into much in a kitchen, to stretch a handful of flour into food for 3 days, to make a beef bone into a broth that could revive even the sickest. Maeve cared for Aunt Deirdre for 5 years, watching the old woman fade slowly like a candle burning down without haste. When her aunt's heart finally found peace on a March dawn, Maeve realized she had no one left in the world. The landlord of the cottage appeared even before the burial to ask when she would vacate. There was no inheritance, no distant relative, no man waiting. There was only the road and the stubborn hope that somewhere, someone needed a young woman who knew how to work. She gathered the few things she had in her satchel, tucked her mother's recipe book among her clothes, like guarding a sacred relic, and left without looking back, because looking back was a luxury that people without a home couldn't afford. The farmstead appeared at the end of that afternoon, like a mirage in the middle of nowhere. Maeve could barely believe it when she saw the timber gate, the wide farmyard, the white-walled house with a slate roof, the byre with a few thin cows, and a pen of chickens scratching aimlessly. It wasn't a rich place, but it was a place of people, and people meant the possibility of a hot meal and a corner to sleep. She stopped at the edge of the lane, tidied the braid the wind had half undone, shook the dust from her light dress, which wasn't so light anymore after 3 days of walking, and took a deep breath before pushing open the gate. The groan of the timber echoed across the yard and was enough to catch the attention of those within. The first thing Maeve saw was the girl. She was sitting on a low stool near the chicken coop, peeling potatoes with a knife that seemed too big for her small hands. She had brown hair cut chin-length, a simple dress of worn fabric, and an expression on her face that didn't suit any child, because it was the expression of one who had already learned that the world is not a safe place. The girl stopped what she was doing and looked at Maeve, without speaking, without nodding, without smiling. She just stared, measuring the stranger from head to toe, with a seriousness that clutched at one's heart. Maeve was about to open her mouth to speak when she heard the crying. It came from inside the house, a weak cry from a baby whose voice was already hoarse from so much weeping, and along with it came the man, Garrett appeared at the front door like someone emerging from an endless battle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with huge hands, like someone who had worked the land since childhood. But everything about him screamed weariness. His beard was unshaven for days. His crumpled linen shirt had a milk stain on his shoulder, and his deep-set eyes carried that kind of exhaustion that isn't cured by a night's sleep, because it wasn't just his body that was spent. In his left arm, he held a baby of about 7 or 8 months, wrapped in a cloth that had seen better days, and the child squirmed and whimpered with the restlessness of one who needed something the father couldn't provide. Garrett looked at Maeve with surprise and something akin to suspicion, because in those days, a woman alone on the road raised questions. Maeve swallowed her nervousness and spoke in the firmest voice she could muster, apologizing for the bother and saying she just wanted a glass of water before continuing her journey. Garrett descended the 2 steps of the porch carefully, balancing the baby, who wouldn't stop fidgeting, and replied that there was water, but she would have to come in and help herself, as he couldn't put the child down. Maeve thanked him and walked to the house, passing the girl who remained still on the stool, following the stranger's every step with those watchful eyes. When Maeve entered the kitchen, what she saw made her heart shrink in a way she knew, because it was the same sad disarray she had seen in Aunt Deirdre's cottage in her last months, when the old woman could no longer keep things in order. The peat hearth was cold, with days of accumulated ash. Dirty pots were piled in the stone sink. Dried food remnants clung to the table. There was no sign of supper being prepared. No smell of stew on the fire, no bread cooling on a cloth. She looked at the earthenware jug in the corner, poured herself water, and drank slowly, thinking. Then she looked again at the kitchen, at the pots, at the dead hearth, at the window through which she saw Garrett in the yard unsuccessfully trying to calm the baby, while the girl returned to peeling potatoes with mechanical movements. Maeve thought of the road that awaited her outside, of the uncertain villages, of the doors that might open or not, and she thought of that house that needed someone just as she needed a place. The decision formed before reason could argue. She left the kitchen, went to the porch where Garrett had sat with the baby, and spoke plainly, without asking permission for her own courage. "Mr. Garrett, I see the hearth is cold and the children haven't had supper. If you let me stay, I can make supper. And if the supper is any good, we can talk about the rest." Garrett looked at this young woman with undone braid and dusty dress, who had appeared out of nowhere, offering food like offering salvation, and felt a mixture of astonishment and suspicion, warring with a weariness he could no longer bear. He should say no, he should thank her for her politeness and send her on her way, but the baby was crying in his arm. His daughter was outside peeling potatoes alone, like a miniature old woman, and it had been 3 days since any of them had eaten a proper meal. The shame of admitting he couldn't cope weighed less than his children's hunger. He nodded, a short gesture, and Maeve didn't wait for him to change his mind. She entered the kitchen like entering a work field, rolled up her dress sleeves, and started with the hearth. She cleared the old ash, arranged the turf that was piled in the corner, and with the skill of one who had done it her whole life, lit the fire on the first try. As the flames gained strength, she rummaged through the pantry and found beans soaking that no one had cooked, a piece of rashers, oatmeal, some eggs, and the potatoes the girl was peeling outside. It wasn't much, but Maeve had learned from her mother that cooking isn't a matter of abundance, it's a matter of knowing. In less than an hour, the kitchen of that farmstead smelled of real food for the first time in many months. The stew bubbled thick in the iron pot, the boiled potatoes steamed in a dish, the fried eggs gleamed in the black skillet, and the smell spread through the entire house, like a living presence pushing sadness out of every corner. The girl was the first to appear at the kitchen door, drawn by the scent like a wild animal sniffing out food. She stood there, still holding the potato knife she hadn't put down, looking at Maeve with that mix of hunger and suspicion that broke one's heart. Maeve didn't force conversation. She simply set the table with what she found. She placed 3 plates and served the food in silence, as if she did it every day, as if she had always belonged in that kitchen. Garrett entered with the baby in his arm, stopped at the door, and looked at the set table with an expression Maeve couldn't read, but which seemed like pain mixed with something else. He sat down slowly, settled the child on his lap, and looked at the plate as if he couldn't believe it was real. They ate almost without speaking. The girl, whom Maeve would discover was named Clara, ate everything on her plate and kept looking at the pot with a hunger that wasn't just for food. Maeve served her more without asking, and the girl accepted without thanking, but ate each mouthful with an attentiveness that spoke more than any words. Garrett ate slowly, chewing carefully, and Maeve noticed he was fighting something within himself, an emotion that men of that time and place didn't allow themselves to show. The baby, who had calmed with the warmth of the kitchen and the smell of food, fell asleep on his father's lap with his mouth slightly open. And when supper was over and silence settled in that warm kitchen, Garrett looked at Maeve and simply said that the small room at the back was empty and that she could stay for the night, and they would talk in the morning. Maeve thanked him with a nod and collected the dishes. She washed everything in silence, while Garrett took the children to their rooms, and when she was alone in the kitchen, she heard the sounds of the farm settling down for the night. The distant lowing of cattle, the wind in the orchard trees, the crackle of the last embers in the hearth. Before going to the small room, her eyes stopped on a photograph hanging on the living room wall, between a wooden crucifix and a dried sprig of rosemary. It was a portrait of a young woman, with light eyes and dark hair, with a serene smile that seemed to bless the entire house. Maeve looked at that face and felt something strange stir in her chest, a feeling that was neither sadness nor joy, but something she couldn't yet name. She quickly averted her gaze and went to the room, where she lay on the narrow bed with its thin mattress and closed her eyes, listening to the house's breathing around her. That night, for the first time in weeks, no one cried on that farm, neither the baby, nor the girl, nor the man. And Maeve, who had nowhere to lay her head that morning, fell asleep, feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, that cold hearth had been waiting for her. The sun was still sleeping behind the braes when Maeve opened her eyes that first morning. Her body ached from the journey, but her mind was already awake before the rest, because the mind of a woman who needs to prove her worth doesn't rest properly. She got up, put on the same dress she had washed the night before, and hung by the window, and walked barefoot down the dark corridor to the kitchen. Everything was as she had left it, clean and tidy, and the silence of the house was the kind that makes you hear even your own heart beating. Maeve lit the hearth in the dark, by practice, by touch, by the instinct that years of cooking had etched into her hands. And when the first flames illuminated the whitewashed walls, she felt she was doing the right thing, setting water to boil. She found a handful of roasted coffee in a tin pot, ground it in a mortar, and slowly strained it, letting the strong aroma fill every room like a silent invitation. Garrett appeared at the kitchen door before the coffee was ready, with the baby draped over his arm, and the expression of one who hadn't slept enough, but was used to it. He stood for a moment, watching Maeve move around the kitchen, as if she knew every corner, every pot, every spoon. And something in that scene unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't a bad discomfort, it was the unease of seeing someone occupy a space that had been empty for too long, like when you open a window after months of being shut, and the strong light hits your eyes. Maeve noticed his presence and offered coffee without ceremony, already preparing a mug of warm milk for the baby, with the care of one who knows that a small child needs the right amount of nourishment. Garrett accepted the coffee and sat at the table, unsure what to say, because morning conversation wasn't a habit he had maintained since Roisin had left them. It was there, over that first morning's coffee, that the two sealed their agreement without needing many words. Garrett said he had no money to pay wages, that the farm had been producing only the bare necessities since he was alone, that he barely managed the cattle and the planting without having to rush indoors every time because of the children. Maeve replied that she wasn't asking for wages, she was asking for a roof, food, and the right to stay, as long as she was useful. She said she knew how to cook, wash, sew, tend a garden, and care for children, and that she wasn't afraid of hard work. Garrett remained silent for a while, turning the mug in his thick hands, and then nodded in that economical way Maeve would learn to recognize as his way of saying everything without wasting a syllable. So it was agreed, simple as a handshake at a gate, and Maeve rolled up her sleeves before the sun had even fully risen. The first days were of hard work and cautious silence. Maeve transformed that abandoned kitchen into the heart of a home once again. She woke before everyone else, lit the hearth, prepared coffee with soda bread or oatmeal, fed little Thomas the perfectly made oatmeal gruel, and had lunch ready when Garrett returned from the fields, covered in sweat and dust. The house began to smell of a home cared for. The pots gleamed again on the wall hooks. Clothes appeared, washed and folded in the chests. The farmyard was swept. The garden, which had become overgrown, was weeded anew, and slowly, new cabbage, chives, parsley, and mint plants sprouted there, which Maeve planted with seeds she obtained from a passing drover. Garrett observed everything with an astonishment he tried to conceal. He returned from the fields each day to find the house transformed, his children clean and fed, supper steaming on the hearth, and he felt a gratitude so immense it sometimes ached in his chest. Because gratitude, when mixed with guilt, becomes a knot difficult to untie. The guilt had resided in him since the night Roisin fell ill. It had been a fever that arrived without warning, one of those the country folk called the ague, or bog fever, which took strong people in a matter of days. Garrett was in a distant pasture, tending to a bull that had fallen into a ditch, and when he returned 2 days later, Roisin was already burning with fever in bed, her eyes glazed, her body trembling under 3 blankets. He rode all night to the village to fetch the doctor, but by the time they reached the farm, the fever had already done its damage. Roisin lasted 2 more days, delirious, calling for her children, and died on a rainy dawn with Garrett's hand clutching hers. Clara was awake when it happened. She was 5 years old and saw everything from her bedroom door. She saw her father cry for the first time. She saw her mother stop breathing, and from that day on, the girl was no longer a child. It was precisely Clara who was the challenge Maeve hadn't anticipated. The girl didn't scream, didn't throw tantrums, didn't cry. She did something worse. She ignored Maeve as if she didn't exist. When Maeve served her plate, Clara pushed it aside and ate dry oatmeal with her hands, because dry oatmeal was what her father had given her before. When Maeve tried to comb the girl's tangled hair, she would duck away, without a word, and hide behind the chicken coop. When Maeve tidied her room, Clara would mess it all up again and put things back in the wrong places where they had been before, as if maintaining the clutter was keeping her mother alive. It was a silent and fierce resistance, nothing childish about it. And Maeve, who had seen pain in many forms, recognized there the most dangerous pain of all, that of someone who refuses to let anything new in for fear of losing again. Maeve didn't force, didn't insist on the comb, didn't compel her to eat, didn't try to hug when she wasn't wanted. She simply remained constant, like the hearth lit every morning, present like the smell of food at the right time, and let the girl come in her own time, if she came at all. Meanwhile, she dedicated to little Tomas the care the boy had needed for months. The baby was thin, irritable, cried a lot at night with colic that kept everyone awake. Maeve realized that Garrett was feeding the boy pure cow's milk, too thick for such a young child's stomach, and changed everything. She began to dilute the milk, warm it to the right temperature, add a pinch of sugar, and a trickle of fennel tea she planted in the window box. In less than a week, the colic diminished. In 2 weeks, Tomas slept through the night. In a month, he was a different baby, plump, smiling, stretching his little arms when he saw Maeve approach. Garrett saw all of this and softened inside without realizing it. He started returning from the fields earlier, not because the work had lessened, but because the house had once again become a place he wanted to be. He began to talk more during meals, first about things from the farm, then about the children, then about subjects that had no practical use, but filled the silence with something good. Maeve listened with genuine attention, asked questions about the cattle, about the planting, about the land, and Garrett found himself explaining things with a patience he didn't know he possessed, almost smiling when she understood quickly. But neither of them touched on the subject that hung over the house like a rain cloud that wouldn't fall. Neither of them spoke of Roisin. The second week brought the first visit from outside. Old Niall, a neighboring farmer advanced in years, appeared one Wednesday afternoon, mounted on a bay horse that had seen better days. Much like its owner, he was a respected man in the region, a widower himself, but of an old grief, one of those that turn into a thick shell around the heart. He had lost his wife more than 15 years ago and never recovered, living alone on a farm too large for one man, with hired hands, who took care of everything, while he slowly withered away in a rocking chair, surrounded by whiskey and silence. Old Niall liked Garrett as one likes a son they never had, and would visit occasionally to check if the lad was bearing the weight. That day, he found the house different, and the young woman in the kitchen, and his eyebrows rose higher than his hat when he took it off. Garrett explained the situation in a few words, and old Niall listened in silence, his gaze moving between the man, the woman, and the children, with that expression of one who has lived long enough to know that life weaves plots no one plans. The old man didn't say if he approved or disapproved. He simply drank the tea Maeve served, praised the soda bread with a grunt that was the closest he came to a compliment. And when it was time to leave, he pulled Garrett aside in the farmyard. What he said was short and direct. The young woman seemed decent folk, and the house was better than he had seen it in months. But the village folk already knew, because drovers carried news faster than the wind, and Eilish, Roisin's godmother who ran the shop in the square, was telling anyone who would listen that Garrett had taken a woman before his wife's mourning period was even over. Garrett felt his blood boil, but old Niall raised a hand, asking for calm, and said he wasn't there to judge, that everyone knew the pain they carried and the remedy they needed, but that Garrett should be careful because village rumor could ruin more than a flood. That night, after Garrett had retired and the house grew dark, Maeve sat on the bed in the back room with her mother's recipe book open on her lap. She turned the pages slowly, reading the notes written in small, slanted pencil script, and each recipe brought with it the ghost of a memory. The orange cake from Sunday afternoons, the rice pudding from St. Patrick's Day, the gruel her mother made when Maeve was sick. In the middle of the book, between the recipe for shortbread and for treacle toffee, there was a torn page. The paper stub that remained showed it had been torn out in a hurry, and Maeve ran her finger along the jagged edge with an old sadness. It was the recipe for the birthday cake her mother made for her. A fresh cream cake with berry compote, which tasted of childhood and of belonging. The page had been lost in the move after her mother's death, or perhaps before. Maeve never knew. She only knew that since that recipe disappeared, she had never celebrated a birthday again, because without that cake, the date was just another empty day. She closed the notebook, tucked it under her pillow, and put out the lamp. It was then that she heard a sound. Small footsteps in the corridor, light as a cat's paw. Maeve lay motionless in bed, holding her breath, and heard the steps stop in the kitchen. She waited a while and then got up slowly, walking silently to the door. What she saw made her heart clench in a way she hadn't expected. Clara stood in front of the kitchen window, barefoot, in a white nightgown, her face pressed against the dark glass, looking out. The girl wasn't crying, wasn't making a sound, just stood there, staring at the country lane that vanished into the dark, waiting. Maeve understood without needing an explanation, because some things are understood with the heart, not the head. Clara was waiting for her mother to return. Every night, while her father slept the heavy sleep of exhaustion, that 6-year-old girl would get up and go to the window to wait for her mother to appear on the lane, because no one had managed to convince her heart that those who go beneath the earth don't return by the path above. Maeve returned to her room in silence, without the girl noticing, and lay with her eyes open in the dark for a long time, feeling the weight of what she now knew. Taking care of that house wasn't just a matter of a lit hearth and washed clothes. It was a matter of healing wounds no one saw, that bled in the dark, that hurt most those too young to understand what it means to lose forever. The weeks passed in that rhythm of routine that settles in without asking permission, and Garrett's farmstead began to take on a look it hadn't had in a long time. Maeve's garden was already bearing its first fruits. The farmyard was always swept. The chickens began laying regularly again, because now they had feed at the right time. And the house smelled of food all day long, because Maeve was one of those women who cooked as if they prayed, with the faith that food heals what medicine cannot reach. Garrett worked better in the fields, since he no longer had to carry the baby tied to his back, nor rush indoors at every cry. The cattle grew fatter, the crop promised a good harvest, and the 2 hired hands who came to help with the heavy work commented among themselves that the master was looking like himself again. But if inside the gate life was settling, outside the storm was slowly brewing, like those summer rains that darken the sky gradually, before pouring down all at once. The gossip reached the village before Maeve had completed a month on the farm and arrived in the worst way, through the mouths of those who believe they own other people's morals. Eilish, widow of the former shop owner, and now owner herself of the business and of all the conversations that passed through there, had been Roisin's godmother and Clara's godparent, and considered herself the guardian of the deceased's memory. She was a woman of noisy faith and selective charity, one of those who pray the rosary at the church door for all to see and talk about other people's lives as if it were community service. When a drover who had met the young woman on the road commented in the shop that he had seen a young woman entering the widower's farm, Eilish felt she had received a sacred mission. She spent the entire week spreading the news with that tone of false concern, which is calumny's favorite disguise, saying poor Roisin, barely cold and her husband has put another in her place, that the young woman must be one of those who wander from farm to farm looking for a widower with land, that the children were being raised by a stranger, without family or proper guidance. The poison spread through the village like an oil slick on water, and when Garrett appeared at the monthly market to sell cheese and buy provisions, he felt the stares before he heard the words. The women whispered behind the stalls. The men averted their faces as he passed, and even the baker, who always saved him fresh soda bread, pretended his stock had run out. Garrett was not a man to care about other people's tongues. He had thick skin for that sort of thing. But when he returned to the farm that afternoon and saw Maeve on the porch with Tomas in her lap, singing a lullaby softly while the sun warmed her face, he felt for the first time the fear that this situation could end, that outside pressure could ruin what was working on the inside. He said nothing to Maeve about the market. He kept his discomfort to himself, as men of that time did, burying worry under work, like planting a seed and pretending to forget it. But Eilish was not a woman to stick to just gossip. One Friday afternoon, as the sun was losing its strength, Maeve had just put the beans to soak for the next day. The sound of a cart stopped at the gate, and 3 women descended with expressions of those going to a wake. Eilish came first, dressed in black as always, with her rosary hanging from her neck and a prayer book under her arm like a war shield. Behind her came 2 village women, Siobhan and Aisling, who served more as an audience than anything else. Garrett was in the fields, and Maeve was alone with the children. When she saw the 3 women cross the farmyard towards the house, her stomach dropped, but she straightened her back and went to greet them on the porch with the dignity of one who owes nothing to anyone. Eilish didn't even wait to be invited in. She said she had come to see the children, that as Clara's godmother, she had an obligation to look after her godchildren's well-being, and that the village folk were worried about the situation in that house. The words came out coated in honey, but the venom was in every pause, in every glance. Eilish cast at Maeve's clothes, hanging on the line next to Garrett's shirts, in the way she inspected the kitchen, looking for fault, in the way she picked Tomas off the floor and scrutinized him, as if expecting to find marks of neglect. Maeve remained quiet, not because she was cowardly, but because she knew that a poor woman, unattached, arguing with a woman of standing in a small village, that was a battle lost before it began. She let Eilish wander through the house, let the village women make their faces and remarks. And when she thought the storm would pass without rain, the lightning struck. Eilish stopped before the photograph of Roisin on the living room wall and turned to Maeve, her eyes moist with an emotion that was half real and half performance. She said that this was Roisin's house, that this kitchen was Roisin's, that these children were Roisin's, and that no passing stranger had the right to occupy the place of a woman who had barely been in her grave a year. Then, she looked at Maeve with a new, lingering attention, and said something that made Maeve's blood run cold. She said it was funny how Maeve resembled Roisin, the same kind of hair, the same way of walking, and that perhaps that was why Garrett had accepted her so quickly, because he wasn't looking for a helper, but a copy of his dead wife. The women fell silent, and the air in the room grew heavy as before a storm. Maeve felt the words strike a place she didn't know she had, because until that moment, she hadn't noticed the resemblance Eilish pointed out. But now, with Roisin's portrait on the wall behind her, and Eilish's venomous gaze in front, doubt settled in like a thorn that enters the flesh and breaks off inside. Clara appeared at the living room door in the midst of it all, drawn by the strange voices. And when she saw her godmother, she began to cry for the first time since Maeve had arrived. It wasn't the cry of a child wanting comfort. It was the cry of someone recognizing a person from a time that hurt. And Eilish took the opportunity to pick up the girl in her arms and cast a silent look of triumph at Maeve, as if to say that here was proof that the children needed familiar people, not a stranger. Maeve felt the ground shift beneath her feet, but she didn't waver outwardly. She waited for Eilish and the women to leave, waved from the gate with a firm hand, and only when the cart disappeared around the bend in the lane did she lean against the wall and let her body slide to the ground, trembling all over. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something worse. It was doubt biting within, asking if Eilish wasn't right, if Garrett hadn't seen her as a shadow of another, if this place was truly hers, or if she was just warming in borrowed space. When Garrett returned from the fields at the end of the afternoon and found the signs of the visit, the poorly made supper and Maeve with red eyes she tried to hide. He didn't need much explanation to understand what had happened. He remained silent for a long time, eating without tasting, and when Maeve got up to clear the dishes, he spoke without looking at her, his voice low and careful, like someone treading on dangerous ground. He said that Eilish didn't run that farm, and that Maeve wasn't going anywhere. Maeve stopped with her back to him, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, and asked, without turning, if he wanted her there for herself, or because she resembled someone else. The silence that followed was one that weighed tons. Garrett slowly put down his fork, looked at the back of the woman who had saved his home and his children, and felt a confusion in his chest that he couldn't untangle. He said he had never thought about it, that for him, Maeve was Maeve, and Roisin was Roisin, and that if there was a resemblance, he hadn't noticed. But the words came out uncertain, and Maeve perceived the hesitation as a blow. She finished washing the dishes in silence and retired to her room without saying goodnight. And that was the first time the two of them slept with a distance between them, not of meters, but of unresolved things. The following days were strange and tense, with Maeve working harder than ever but speaking less than ever, and Garrett circling the house with guilt, unsure what to apologize for. He found himself looking at Roy Sin's photograph on the wall and then at Maeve in the kitchen, comparing unintentionally, looking for the resemblance Eilish had planted in his head, and getting annoyed with himself for not being able to stop. Maeve noticed the stares and closed herself off even more, and the house that had started to breathe again began to suffocate. Clara, with the sharp intuition that wounded children develop, felt the change in the air and became guarded again, as if Eilish's visit had reopened the wound that had barely begun to heal. The girl stopped eating Maeve's food again, went back to peeling potatoes alone in the farmyard, returned to long silences and hard stares. It was as if the entire house was moving backward, undoing everything Maeve had woven with such care. It was in this stretched, taut atmosphere that the longest night on that farm arrived. Tomas began to cough after supper, a small cough that turned to phlegm, and before midnight transformed into a fever. Maeve felt the boy's forehead and recognized the dangerous heat she had felt many times caring for Aunt Deirdre. She prepared elderflower tea, quickly made wet compresses, kept the boy in her lap, trying to bring down the temperature with everything she knew, but the fever wouldn't break. Tomas burned like an ember, his tiny body shaking with chills, his breathing coming out with a wheeze that filled the house with fear. Garrett, seeing his son in that state, felt terror climb his spine like a living thing, because that scene was an exact repetition of what had happened with Roisin. The same fever, the same tremor, the same glazed eyes. The memory returned whole, cruel, and with it came the panic of one who already knows how this story can end. Garrett grabbed his hat and said he was going to fetch the doctor in the village, that he wouldn't wait for dawn, that he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Maeve tried to argue that the lane was dark and that it had rained that afternoon, that the path would be dangerous, but she saw something in his eyes that brooked no argument. It was the despair of a father who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose anything more. He saddled the horse in the darkness, mounted without looking back, and vanished down the lane like a shadow swallowed by the night. Maeve was left alone with the two children, the baby burning with fever in her arms, and Clara sleeping in her room, unaware of anything. The house felt enormous around her, every shadow seeming larger, every sound from the fields outside seeming like a threat. And Maeve prayed softly as she changed the compresses, asking God not to take anyone else from that house, which had already given too much of its share of suffering. It was close to 2 in the morning when the worst happened, not with Tomas, who remained feverish but stable in Maeve's arms, but with Clara. The girl woke up with the sound of her brothers crying, left her room, and came to the kitchen. And what she saw made her world collapse. She saw Maeve holding the trembling, groaning baby. She saw the wet compresses. She saw the tea on the table. She saw the lamp casting shadows on the wall. And all of it merged in the mind of a 6-year-old child with the night her mother died. Clara's body froze in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes widened, and then came the scream, a sharp, piercing scream that wasn't of fright, but of pure terror. The terror of one reliving the worst night of their life and unable to separate past from present. The girl began to tremble from head to toe, slipped to the floor, and huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, crying in a way that didn't sound like a child's cry. It sounded like the lament of a wounded animal. Maeve felt despair tighten its grip because she had a sick baby in one arm and a panicked girl on the floor, and she was alone in the middle of the night with no one to help. But despair is a luxury a mother cannot afford. And that is exactly what Maeve became at that moment, without realizing it, without planning it, without asking permission. She carefully laid Tomas in the cradle, covered the boy, and knelt on the floor beside Clara. The girl huddled closer, shrinking from her touch like a cornered animal. And Maeve didn't insist. She stayed there on the floor, sitting beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present, like a warm wall protecting from the wind, demanding nothing in return, and began to sing. It was a song her mother used to sing on stormy nights. A simple, repetitive melody that had no pretense of being beautiful. Its pretense was to be safe, to be the same every time, to say without words that as long as that music played, nothing bad would happen. Maeve sang for a long time, repeating the same song as if it were a prayer. And slowly, so slowly it was barely noticeable, Clara's body stopped trembling. Her crying subsided, her sobs became less frequent, and the girl slowly released her knees that she had pressed against her chest. At some point that neither of them could pinpoint, Clara leaned her head on Maeve's shoulder. First, she just leaned, light as a bird alighting, and then she let herself go completely, letting the weight of her small body fall against that woman who smelled of soap and fennel. Maeve stopped singing and remained quiet, feeling the girl's heart beat fast against her arm, and heard when Clara whispered with a voice ravaged by crying a single word that changed everything between them. Stay. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an order. It was surrender. It was a 6-year-old girl saying with the only words she could muster that she couldn't bear to lose anyone else, that she couldn't bear to wait by the window any longer, that if that woman left like her mother had, she wouldn't survive again. Maeve hugged the girl tightly to her chest and cried silently with her, because some pains only pass when you share them with someone who understands. Dawn found the two of them asleep on the kitchen floor, leaning against the wall, Clara curled up in Maeve's lap, like a cub that had finally found shelter. Tomas slept in the cradle beside them, his breathing calmer, his fever visibly lower. That's how Garrett found them when he arrived with the village doctor almost at sunrise, drenched with rain and mud, his horse exhausted. He stopped at the kitchen door and stood looking at that scene, unable to move. Because what he saw wasn't a hired hand caring for children that weren't hers. It was a mother holding his children as if they were the most precious things in the world. The doctor examined Tomas, said it was a throat inflammation, that the fever would subside with the teas and compresses Maeve was already making, that the young woman had acted correctly and that the boy would be well in a few days. Garrett thanked the doctor, paid for the visit with cheese and butter, because money was scarce, and when they were alone again, he looked at Maeve with a clarity he hadn't felt since Roisin's death. At that moment, kneeling beside the chair where Maeve now sat with Clara still sleeping in her lap, Garrett understood that the question about resemblance to Roisin was the wrong question. It didn't matter if Maeve resembled Roisin or anyone else in the world. What mattered was that she had stayed, that in the darkest hour, when he wasn't there, she held everything together alone, held the house, held the sick baby, held the shattered girl. And that wasn't the act of someone who resembles another. It was the act of someone who is someone. He said nothing because he hadn't yet found the right words, but he touched Maeve's hand with the tips of his calloused fingers, and she raised her tired eyes. And what passed between those two gazes was more than any phrase could convey. Something changed on that farm after that night. And it wasn't something that could be seen with the eyes, but that was felt in the air, like one feels the rain before it falls. Garrett woke up differently the next morning, with a firmness in his gaze Maeve hadn't known. A decision that seemed to have been born during the ride in the dark, and matured upon seeing the two women in his life sleeping on the kitchen floor. He drank his coffee in silence. He looked at Clara, who for the first time in weeks sat beside Maeve at the table and ate her soda bread without complaint. He looked at Tomas, who was already showing improvement in his crib with less red cheeks. And then he got up, put on his hat, and said he was going to the village to sort out some things. He didn't explain what things, and Maeve didn't ask, because she had learned that Garrett was a man who spoke through his actions, not his promises. What Garrett did that morning, the entire village knew before noon. He went straight to the chapel and sought out Father Liam, a thin man with white hair and gentle eyes, who had known Garrett since he was a boy, and had baptized both his children, celebrated his marriage to Roisin, and committed her body to the earth. Garrett sat on the front pew of the empty church and told the priest everything with the raw honesty of one who doesn't embellish things. He told him about Maeve, about the working arrangement, about the children's improvement, about Eilish's visit and the gossip, and he also told, in a lower voice, and with his hands clutching his hat on his lap, that he felt something for that woman that he hadn't expected to feel again, and that he didn't know if he had a right to feel. Father Liam listened to everything without interrupting, as men do who have learned that listening is more important than advising. And when Garrett finished, the priest remained silent for a while, looking at the altar crucifix before speaking. What the priest said was simple, and Garrett carried those words for the rest of his life. He said that mourning is not a prison, and that God did not invent longing to prevent anyone from living. That honoring those who have passed is not to wither away with them, but to remain standing, caring for what remains. He said that Roisin had been a good wife and a good mother, but that she was with God, and that the children were on earth needing living care, not dead homage. He said that if Maeve was a good woman, and if Garrett felt in his heart what he was saying with his mouth, then he should do the right thing, marry her before God and the community, and give her the respect of a wife, not the shame of a dependent. Garrett left the church with a lighter heart than when he entered, and went to make his second visit of the day. He stopped his cart in front of Eilish's shop when business was at its peak, with half a dozen people buying and chatting on the pavement. Eilish saw him arrive, a huashut behind the counter, ready for the confrontation she knew was coming. But what Garrett did caught her by surprise. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't threaten. He entered the shop calmly, took off his hat out of politeness, and spoke loudly enough for everyone inside to hear. He said that Eilish had been Roisin's godmother and that he respected that. But that respect ended where meddling began. He said that Maeve was an honorable woman, that she had saved his children from hunger and growing up neglected, that she had done more for that family in weeks than the entire village had done in a year of his widowhood. Because no one, not even Eilish, with all the concern she claimed to have, had shown up to help when he was drowning. The silence in the shop was deafening. Eilish opened her mouth to reply, but Garrett continued. He said that he was going to marry Maeve, that Father Liam already knew, and that the banns would be read on Sunday, and that anyone who wanted to speak could speak freely, because gossip never stopped a proper wedding. He said all this, looking Eilish in the eyes, with a firmness that allowed no retort, and then put his hat back on, bought what he needed at the counter, paid correctly, and left. The people in the shop looked at each other, unsure what to say, and Eilish, for the first time in years, was left without an answer. Not because words failed her, but because deep in that chest covered with rosaries and judgment, something recognized that Garrett was right. She hadn't shown up to help. None of them had. And sometimes the truth hurts more than any offense. Garrett returned to the farm in the early afternoon and found Maeve in the garden, kneeling in the soil, weeding among the cabbage plants, with Tomas sitting on a blanket beside her, and Clara, for the first time, playing near her, not with her, but near, which was already an enormous victory. He dismounted from the cart, walked to the garden, and stood watching the scene for a moment, engraving it in his memory, because he knew everything was about to change, and he wanted to remember how it was before. Maeve looked up and saw something different in his face, a lightness she hadn't known, and waited without getting up, her hands dirty with soil and her heart racing, unsure why. Garrett knelt in front of her, right there in the garden, among the cabbage and chive plants, with the smell of wet earth rising around them, and spoke in the only way he knew how, without frills, without speeches, without kneeling, as in the romances he had never read. He said he had gone to the village to talk to the priest, and that he wanted to marry her if she would accept. He said he couldn't promise the world, because his world was small. It was just that farm, those cattle, those children, but all of that he shared with an open heart. He said he knew she had arrived there asking only for supper and a roof, and that he was incapable of offering beautiful words, but he could offer a surname, a real home, and the certainty that she would never again have to sleep without knowing where she would wake up. Maeve looked at him with eyes full of tears and a trembling mouth, and for a long moment said nothing, because the words were all piled in her throat, unable to come out in order. Then she asked, her voice faltering, if he wanted to marry her, Maeve, and not the memory of someone else. Garrett understood the weight of that question and held her face between his large hands, which still had dust from the road. He looked into her brown eyes, which were not like Roisin's, because Roisin's were light, and her nose, which was not like Roisin's because Roisin's was fine, and her mouth, which was not like Roisin's because Roisin's was smaller, and he said that he was looking at her, only at her, that it was Maeve who had lit the hearth of his house again. It was Maeve who had taught his son to sleep. It was Maeve who had held his daughter on the kitchen floor when the world was falling apart. And it was with Maeve that he wanted to grow old on that porch. She said yes, without speaking the word, because the yes came out as both tears and laughter at the same time. And Clara, who was close enough to hear everything, watched from a distance with that seriousness that was her trademark. Maeve looked at the girl and extended her soil-stained hand, not forcing, not pulling, just offering, as she had done since the first day. Clara stood still for a moment that seemed to last forever, and then walked slowly, step by step, and took Maeve's hand with her small fingers, squeezing tightly. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Garrett looked at the two intertwined hands, and knew that this was the blessing that was missing. More important than the priests, more important than the entire villages. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later, enough time for the banns to be read, and for Maeve to sew a decent dress with fabric Garrett bought in the village. Father Liam read the banns on the following 2 Sundays, and no one came forward to object, although Maeve was sure that Eilish would be in the front row to raise an objection. But Eilish didn't appear at the church on either Sunday, and Maeve later learned, from old Niall, that the shop owner had been quiet since the day Garrett spoke with her, and that some of the village women had begun to change their tune, saying that in the end the widower was right, and that no one had gone to help when he needed it. People are like that, my friends. They turn with the changing wind, and sometimes it only takes one person to speak the truth aloud for the castle of gossip to crumble entirely. The wedding day dawned with that clear September sky that only the countryside knows. painfully blue, so beautiful, with a warm wind that carried the scent of orange blossom from the orchard. The ceremony would be simple, in the small village chapel with few guests. Old Niall would be the best man for Garrett, and the wife of the farm's oldest hired hand would be Maeve's bridesmaid, because she had no family to fill that role. Maeve got ready in the back room, which would soon cease to be just hers. She put on her new unbleached cotton dress, with delicate lace on the collar, which she had embroidered herself at night after the children were asleep. She tied her hair in a firm braid with orange blossoms that Clara had picked in the orchard, and it was precisely this detail that made Maeve cry before the ceremony. The flowers had appeared on her bed early that morning, without a note, without explanation. But Maeve knew it had been Clara, because no one else woke before the sun in that house. In the church, Garrett waited in the suit that only came out of the chest on special occasions, the same one he had worn to marry Roe Sin. And he didn't hide it, nor did he apologize for it, because for Garrett, wearing that suit wasn't repeating the past. It was proving that life continues on the same foundations and that this diminishes nothing. When Maeve entered the chapel, holding a bouquet of wildflowers that Clara carried beside her, walking with her head held high, because she had no father to offer her arm, but she had the dignity to walk alone, Garrett felt his eyes burn and was not ashamed. Father Liam celebrated the ceremony with words that spoke of new beginnings and courage, of hands reaching out in the dark and finding other hands, and when he declared them husband and wife, Clara, sitting in the first pew with Tomas in her lap, did something no one in that church expected. She smiled, a small, almost invisible smile, but it was the girl's first smile in over a year, and those who saw it felt that something more than a wedding was happening there. It was a family being stitched together again with new thread on old fabric. The celebration was at the farm, with a table set in the yard under the big sycamore tree. Simple, abundant food that Maeve had prepared in the preceding days with the help of neighbors, who had finally accepted the situation. There was festive rice, chicken in sauce, stuffing, soda bread, sloe gin, and freshly brewed coffee. The few guests ate and conversed until the sun set, and when they left, the farm settled into the good silence of a house full of peace. Maeve was collecting the dishes in the yard when she felt someone tug the hem of her dress. She looked down and saw Clara with a folded paper in her hand, extending it to her with that solemnity children have when they do something they consider very important. Maeve knelt down and took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, and what she found made her legs weak. It was a recipe written in a round, uncertain child's hand, full of errors and ink smudges, but perfectly legible. Fresh cream cake with berry compote. Maeve looked at Clara, not understanding, her heart beating so fast it seemed to want to escape her chest. And the girl explained in the rushed way of children who have much to say and little practice in saying it. She recounted that she had seen Maeve looking at the recipe book many nights, running her finger over that torn page, and that one day she asked Eilish at the shop if she knew the recipe for fresh cream cake with berry compote, because Eilish had an old recipe book that belonged to her mother. Eilish, whom no one expected to help with anything, looked in her book, found a similar recipe, and dictated it for Clara to copy one afternoon when the girl went to the village with Garrett. The girl had kept the paper under her pillow for days, waiting for the right moment, and decided that the wedding was the moment, because a wedding is a day for gifts, and that was the gift she wanted to give. Maeve held that paper as one holds a sacred relic, and tears flowed without asking permission, thick and hot, wetting her new dress, and the recipe and Clara's hands, which she squeezed between her own. It wasn't just a recipe, my friends. It was the bridge that was missing. It was the girl saying that she accepted Maeve not as a mother's substitute, but as someone new to love. It was the missing page in the notebook and in life. And it was Eilish there in the village, with all her flaws and all her sharp tongue, showing that, beneath the judgment, sometimes exists a heart that knows how to do the right thing when a child asks. Garrett found the two of them embracing in the yard, Maeve kneeling, holding Clara against her chest, both crying and laughing, and he knelt with them and enveloped the two in an embrace that also included Tomas sleeping in the hammock and the memory of Roisin, who didn't need to be forgotten for life to move forward. The months that followed the wedding were of learning and tightening bonds. Maeve stopped being the helper and became the true mistress of the house, the one who decided the menu, who managed the pantry, who negotiated fabric prices at the shop, who had an opinion on where to plant and when to harvest. Garrett discovered that sharing decisions was not weakness, it was intelligence, because Maeve had a practical sense he admired and a courage to take risks that he alone wouldn't have. The farm prospered in those months, as it hadn't in years. They bought more chickens, enlarged the garden, sold cheese at the market with a profit that allowed them to repair the roof and replace the old windows with glass panes that let the morning sun stream in. Tomas grew strong and healthy, becoming a bright boy who chased chickens and called Maeve Mam, with the naturalness of one who had never known another. Clara opened up slowly, like a flower that needs time and patience, and gradually, she stopped being the old child, who silently peeled potatoes to become a child again, playing in the orchard, inventing stories, laughing at silly things. And one moonlit night, Maeve realized that Clara no longer went to the kitchen window to wait for her mother to return. The girl slept peacefully through the night, and that was the greatest victory Maeve achieved in that house, greater than any harvest or renovation. Old Niall, the neighbor who lived alone, brooding over his own widowhood, began to frequent the farm more regularly after the wedding. He would come for Sunday lunch, which Maeve prepared with festive care, and would spend the entire afternoon on the porch, talking with Garrett and playing with the children in an awkward way, like one who lacks practice but has the desire. Maeve noticed that the old man was changing, that being around a living family was thawing something within him that solitude had hardened. On one of those Sundays, old Niall confessed to Garrett, his voice thick with whiskey and emotion, that he had been wrong to shut himself off in mourning for so many years, that his wife wouldn't have wanted to see him rotting alone in a house too big, and that seeing Garrett have the courage to start anew had been a slap and a lesson at the same time. Garrett said nothing, simply refilled the old man's glass again, because in the countryside, there are things best said in shared silence than in any speech. A year and a half after the wedding, on a summer afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer over the land, Maeve called Garrett to sit on the porch and told him, her hands trembling in her lap, that she was expecting a child. Garrett stood still for a moment, with the empty expression of one receiving news too big for his face to contain, and then he smiled in a way Maeve had never seen before, a smile that was complete, without shadow, without reservation, without any ghost behind it. He embraced her right there on the porch, with the strength of one embracing proof that life had not given up on him. And Maeve felt in the tightness of those arms that the question about her resemblance to Roisin had died for good, buried by everything they had built together. The child was born the following spring, a boy they named Cormac, in honor of Maeve's father, whom the road had taken too soon, but whom she never forgot. Eilish sent a gift of a set of knitted baby clothes with a short note that simply said, "For the boy," with wishes for health. Maeve kept that note along with the recipe Clara had copied, because they were proof that people can change when time and truth do their work. The years passed with the haste that years have when life is truly lived. Tomas grew up and became a hard-working lad who helped his father in the fields, with Garrett's same silent dedication. Clara became a beautiful and studious young woman, who learned to read with Father Liam, and then taught the neighborhood children under the sycamore tree in the yard, because the village had no school and she decided she would be the school. Cormac, the youngest, grew up hearing that he had two parents in heaven, his drover grandfather and his Aunt Roisin, who looked after the stars, and never felt that this patched-together family was less of a family than any other. The farm prospered until it became the largest in the region, with good pasture, fat cattle, an orchard that bore fruit all year round, and a big house with open windows, where there were always people at the table and food on the hearth. Old Niall spent his last years frequenting that house as if he were a borrowed grandfather, and when he died of old age on a winter night, it was Garrett who arranged the burial, and Maeve who cooked for the wake, because true family isn't just about blood. Much later, when Garrett's hair had turned white, and Maeve's hands bore the marks of a lifetime of work, the two sat on the same porch where everything had been decided. The sun set behind the braes, painting the sky with that orange that only the countryside knows, and the farm around them was alive, with the sound of grandchildren running in the yard and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Clara, now a grown woman with her own family, had come to visit with her children. Tomas was in the byre with his father, showing his eldest son how to milk a cow. Cormac sent letters from the city where he had gone to study, and in each letter came a piece of longing and the promise to return. Maeve looked at all of it, at the house she had found dead and helped resurrect, at the garden she had planted, at the orchard that had grown, and felt a peace so immense it was beautiful enough to ache. Garrett took her hand, as he did every afternoon on that porch, intertwining his calloused fingers with hers, and asked if she remembered the day she arrived. Maeve smiled and said she remembered everything: the cold hearth, the crying baby, the serious girl in the yard, and the enormous fear she felt of being sent away in the morning. Garrett slowly shook his head and said his fear that day was different. It was the fear of accepting help, of admitting he couldn't cope, of letting someone into a house he had locked along with his grief. Maeve leaned her head on his shoulder and murmured softly the phrase she had said so many years ago, "If you'll have me, I can make supper." Garrett chuckled, that low, raspy laugh of an old man who had cried all there was to cry, and now only knew how to laugh. He replied that she had done much more than supper. She had made the entire house, the entire family, an entire life. And Maeve squeezed his hand and said she hadn't done it alone, that he had left the gate open that afternoon, and sometimes that's all God asks of us. Not grand deeds, not miracles, just that we open the gate when someone needs to come in. And so ends this story, my friends, which is not of love at first sight, not of passion born in a flash and dying in a storm. It is of love built by a hearth lit at dawn, by a hand holding a child on a feverish night, by a plate set at the right time, in a silence that says more than any speech. Finn and Sauemhe, Garrett and Maeve. The names don't matter, because this story happens every time someone has the courage to reach out, and someone has the courage to accept. If this story touched your heart as it touched mine in the telling, hit that like button now, subscribe to the Tales of Old Ireland channel, activate the bell and share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over is not weakness. It is the bravest thing there is. Tell me in the comments, what moment touched your heart the most? Was it Clara's cry on the kitchen floor? Was it the marriage proposal in the garden? Or was it that folded paper with the recipe the girl kept under her pillow? I want to know what stayed in your heart. And always remember, sometimes we think we're just asking for a plate of food, but God knows what we truly need is a home. Until the next story, stay with God, and may He bless your home, just as He blessed Garrett's and Maeve's.